I'm Christian Bax, and today I'm going to be talking about fantasy football and its correlation to sports betting. So a little bit of an introduction on the topic. I first want to define what sports betting and fantasy football is for those who don't know. Fantasy football is essentially like this game that you can play with your friends, where you're trying to predict the performance of players in the NFL. And based on how they perform, it will make your fantasy team better, and then you'll be rewarded for their performance. And then sports betting, you can see this in places like FanDuel or DraftKings. These are all websites where you can sports bet, and you're basically putting money down on the line on these performances of the sports players. So you can kind of see how they're pretty similar. You're both relying on the performances of certain players in both scenarios. So that's why I wanted to bring this up. But why I care about this topic a lot is I've had a long connection to the sport because of my dad. And there's been an increase in interest in fantasy football throughout the world. This is also seen in the statistic with sports betting, where 44.5% year over year increase from 2022. That's just firsthand evidence of how sports betting has completely increased in the last year, and why this topic is extremely important for all of you. So yeah, I've seen this increase firsthand. That's why I wanted to get into this topic. But specifically, how does it impact teams? So there's not a whole lot of literature on this, which is another reason why I want to get into this. So my actual research question is, does participation in fantasy football have a correlation to an increased likelihood in sports betting with young adults in Arizona? This was mostly gathered, like the reason why I chose this research question specifically, after multiple changes. Like this was not the original research question, but it was because of the gap. There was not many there was no literature whatsoever on high school students or my specific population in Arizona. So I wanted to focus a lot on the high school aspect of it, because not a lot of researchers are willing to go in that direction. So my literature review, this is mostly going to be focused on 3 articles here. Toward a better understanding of fantasy football and dehumanization of athletes, examining the impact of fantasy sport participation and fan identification, and examining the psychological factors associated with involvement in fantasy sports. These 3 were kind of the basis of my whole research as a whole. I based a lot of things off of it, especially my method. All 3 of these key articles used a questionnaire, which is why I chose a questionnaire, but they also had a lot of conclusions that a lot of common factors from all 3 sources. For example, they all agreed that the average age of fantasy football participants is 30. They also agreed that 75% of participants in fantasy football and sports betting are male. So yeah, there's a lot of things that they agreed upon. But one thing that might be seen as pretty significant that I gathered from the first article was that some participants in both fantasy football and sports betting tend to dehumanize NFL athletes, which is a pretty big issue, and why this topic is very, very important. Oh, and another thing, they also all agreed that there's a big motivation to participate in fantasy football due to gratification, but they also address the fact that many participants are limited by knowledge, time, accessibility, and interest. So finally, my method, like I talked about earlier, this is mostly gathered from the research articles that I have. This is very qualitative, but I want to focus on the Pearson correlation coefficient specifically in order to see if there was a potential correlation and address my research question. So in order to do this, first, I have a questionnaire as opposed to an interview. This is because I wanted to have a large population of individuals participating in this. If I was just doing an interview, I wouldn't be able to get that high participation rate, and I would only be able to gather data from a very select amount of individuals, which is not going to answer my original research question. So in my questionnaire, there's preliminary and post questions. The preliminary questions are only just to figure out whether or not you do participate in fantasy football, whether or not you participate in sports betting, and then from there, if you answered yes to both of them, then you would be able to do the post questions. And the post questions can vary, but they're all heavily related to the two topics and are more on the qualitative aspects of it. So for data collection, these are the two preliminary questions that I was talking about. Do you participate in fantasy football and do you participate in sports betting? As you can see, 69% of the 213 total participants that I gathered in the month of data collection, 69% said that they did participate in fantasy football and 31% that said they didn't. However, this is the complete opposite with sports betting, where 34.3% said that they participated in sports betting and 65.7% said they didn't. So when I was going into this research, I originally theorized that like these two percentages would be pretty high, at least the first one where it's like 69%, but this was not the case in the second one right here. So here's some examples of the post questions. As you can see, to me, fantasy football is just another way to bet on pro football. I play fantasy football because it makes watching football more enjoyable. These are just two examples, but you can kind of see how these questions were laid out. Specifically, how you can answer it with strongly disagree, disagree, neutral, agree, and strongly agree. Those five options allow me to create a Pearson correlation coefficient as opposed to the first two, which are just going to give me percentages on the participation rate. So finally, some data analysis. As seen by the preliminary questions, 7 in 10 of the population that was addressed in high school participate in fantasy football. 3 in 10 participate in sports betting. And then with the post questions, there's a very low correlation coefficient in nearly every scenario. So the highest correlation coefficient was approximately 0.474, which is not extremely high whatsoever. In order to see if there's a really, really close correlation, you want that number to be closer to 1. But as seen right here, like they were not very close to 1 in any of the scenarios. So that leads me to the conclusion that there's very low correlation whatsoever. And then 73 of the 213 participants were given the opportunity to participate in the post questions. So let me remind you what that means. That means 73 people answered yes to the fact that they participate in sports betting and they participate in fantasy football. So finally, some conclusion and limitations. Based on all of this, I wanted to think about doing a potential interview in the future. I think this could be a good potential method like in the future, but can't do it now. But it would be focused on the 73 participants that answered the post questions. And as seen, like I mentioned earlier, like I didn't do this now because the survey is the only thing that's going to be able to get the participants that I needed. Also, I wanted to address like a potential bias. Based on the population that was chosen, a high school in Arizona with all male in a Jesuit setting. Therefore, some of the individuals are going to have a little bit of a bias. Like I mentioned earlier, 75% of participants in the world that participate in fantasy football and sports betting are male. So if the survey itself is going to be completed in a setting where it's only males, then it's going to potentially lead to bias, and the data could potentially be skewed a little bit, but I don't think it was that big of a deal. And then the overall time of the survey, the data collection for the survey was only about a month long. If it was longer, there could have been more participants other than the 213. However, 213 was beyond my goal and is representative of the population. And also, one more thing that I wanted to do differently is potentially changing the way that the preliminary questions were asked, so that way they could be answered in the same fashion as the post questions with strongly agree, strongly disagree, and that way I could create Pearson correlation coefficients for those. So yeah, thank you.